1776, Thomas Jefferson recorded the precise grievances against British despots that had long been present in the American psyche, yet had never been so eloquently articulated. Chief among these sacred liberties of any free people was this dictum: all men are created equal. Nevertheless, in clear-headed and well-informed retrospection, one notes that for the majority of American history, this notion had merely been treated to hollow lip service. A crucial period of development in American attitudes about racial inequality, in specific, was the temporal span from 1945 to 1960. Black activists, utilizing numerous avenues towards change, including televised demonstrations like sit-ins and marches, civil disobedience, and judicial challenge, made groundbreaking achievements in the pursuit of true equality. However, such progress inevitably inspired reactionary resistance, as shown by the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, the implementation of white citizens' councils, and the brutal mistreatment of peaceful protesters, who were assaulted with fire hoses and attack dogs. The civil rights movement would forever alter the lives of contemporary and future Americans, marking multiple watersheds in the pursuit of a more perfect union, one in which all men, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
African Americans fought courageously in the Second World War, bringing honor to the name of the United States military by acquiring accolades for their prowess in combat, both from their own country as well as from others, as the 92nd Infantry Division did, winning numerous medals of honor, distinguished service crosses, legions of merit, and even an Order of the Crown of Italy. Nevertheless, these courageous men returned home to a welcome that was at best lukewarm, and at worst openly hostile. The demeaning institutions of segregation and Jim Crow laws persisted despite their acts of service, and the stark disparity between the treatment they received overseas and domestically drove many to pursue political and social change in order to advance their status at home as much as it had been abroad. In addition, race relations began to deteriorate further as African American wartime workers were among the first to be replaced by white veterans in search of employment. This inequitable mistreatment further sparked outrage in the black community, as their contributions to the war effort, though integral to the successful execution of Allied invasions and advances, were seen as, evidently, somehow less meaningful than those of other workers. However, as the American civil rights movement drew to a close, progress made in the pursuit of equality allowed Americans in racial minorities to feel more comfortable in embracing their identities in the pluralistic nation they were residents of.
American propaganda efforts during the Cold War were severely hindered by the ugly ubiquity of racial inequality in domestic life. The Soviet media leapt on this reality to propagate their own narrative, one in which the exploitative capitalist demands for cheap labor and a deferential federal government in regards to Southern discrimination provided the ideal breeding grounds for racist ideologies. International repercussions of this critical coverage damaged the United States' standing with third world countries, which are largely composed of people of color, at a time when the two major global superpowers were vying for favor with the nations in Africa, South America, and Asia. Discrimination in the North and South assumed two unique flavors: de facto and de jure segregation. In the northern states, prejudice doctrines were not enforced by law, rather social dogma contributed to the organic rise of segregation. For instance, school assignment was determined based on domicile, and due to residential segregation itself a result of income inequality, this led to inferior educational facilities and inexperienced teachers in poor neighborhoods, and school budgets depending on property taxes. This disproportionality affected African Americans as they were more likely to be impoverished. De facto segregation in the North was often more difficult to combat since its causes were often rooted in personal prejudice and economic inequities rather than concrete legislation. In contrast, in the South, de jure segregation was implemented in the form of laws passed to ensure the continued existence of racial separation and white supremacy. As a result, racism in the South was oftentimes more violent than that in the North, taking tangible forms in lynchings and public beatings.
In the 1950s, many new middle-class families moved from the cities to the suburbs. Some wanted to escape the noise of the city. Others wanted to own their own homes. Left in the cities were the extremes of wealth, the rich and the racial minorities who simply did not have the money to move out. The minorities could rarely find opportunities, as cities lacked programs like healthcare and proper schooling. Many times, these groups couldn't even find homes. Many landlords made racially restrictive covenants, in which they agreed not to sell land to minority groups. The 1949 Housing Act cleared land in the cities of slums and replaced them with high-end apartments. Urban redevelopment, as it was called, forced many of the poor to go in search of other living accommodations.
Popular culture began to reflect the social upheavals of the 1940s and 50s, with the advent of black writers offering a unique perspective on the African American situation, such as Black Boy, published in 1945. In addition, Richard Wright's novel Native Son, published in 1940, and Gunnar Myrdal's 1944 study, An American Dilemma, exposed cruel cycles of oppression and scapegoating as major contributors to the persecuted state of black Americans. In addition, the color barrier was finally broken in 1947, when Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, the first black man to play Major League Baseball. Audiences were exhilarated as they observed his flamboyant and aggressive playing style, sending even the fastest of pitches rocketing towards the heavens. Organized protests also began during this time period. In Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, after Rosa Parks, a longtime NAACP activist, refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, Martin Luther King Jr. began mass boycotts of the segregated buses in the state. He intended to draw national attention to the mistreatment of black Americans simply seeking equality with their white brethren in the Jim Crow South. Revenue for the bus company suffered as a result of these mass boycotts, and despite pressure from Alabama officials on African Americans to resume the use of these segregated buses, the boycott held strong. Finally, Alabama was ordered to integrate its buses by the Supreme Court. The goals of the boycott had been accomplished, and a new leader for the civil rights movement had arisen.
Another early example of organized protest in the civil rights movement was the Greensboro sit-ins of 1960. 4 black students attending North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College entered a local Woolworths and sat down at a whites-only lunch counter. Nervous and jittery, they had expected to be savagely beaten or at least arrested. Nonetheless, on an anticlimactic first day, they were merely refused service and couldn't be arrested when police arrived. 45 minutes after the store closed, the young men went home. Despite this, they returned with 20 fellow students in solitary, and as the occupation grew, local media began to take note of the students' actions. Unable to resist the steady resolve of the dissidents, the Greensboro Woolworths was desegregated. Encouraged by the success of these demonstrations and others like it, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was created to coordinate student-led protest. Nevertheless, such progress was not unchallenged. In the South, regressive theories of white supremacy manifested themselves in reactionary organizations like the revived Ku Klux Klan. A heinous atrocity was committed in August of 1955 when Emmett Till, a boy of only 14 years of age, was lynched for speaking to a white woman.
One of the local boys said, "Hey, there's a girl in that store there, so I bet you want to go in there and talk to her, you know." So he went in there to get some candy. So when he was leaving out the store, after buying the candy, he told us, "Say bye, baby." And the next thing I knew, one of the boys came up to me and say, "Man, you got a crazy cousin. He just went in there and said bye to that white woman." And that's when this man I was playing checker with, this older man, I guess he must have been around about 60 or 70, he jumped straight up and said, "Boy," say, "y'all about to get out of here." Say, "That lady come out of that store and blow y'all brains off."
However, it would be remiss to believe that racist sentiment was limited to any particular geographical region of the United States. Organizations called White Citizens Councils sprang up in the North. Referred to as the Uptown KKK, they procured state funding for private schools for white children who did not want to go to integrated schools, and they used their collective economic power against black activism. High-ranking officials such as J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI thought white citizens councils limited communist influence in civil rights activism and thereby silently permitted them to engage in such actions as cross burnings and race riots.
After World War II, the idea of civil rights for African Americans gained renewed momentum. In February 1946, news reached the White House describing how a black sergeant named Isaac Woodard had his eyes gouged out only 3 hours after his discharge from the army. Coupled with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan, this news horrified Harry Truman. Feeling the need to take action, Truman ordered the creation of the President's Committee on Civil Rights. Its report to secure these rights called for anti-lynching and anti-segregation laws and legislation, ensuring voting rights and equal employment for African Americans. Furthermore, in 1948, Truman issued two more executive orders. The first ended segregation in the federal government, while also creating the Employment Board of the Civil Service Commission, and the second desegregated the Army. In the 1940s, the NAACP, led by Thurgood Marshall, prosecuted many cases related to civil rights. In the 1944 case of Smith v. Allwright, the white-only primaries held by the Democratic Party in the South were outlawed. Segregation on interstate bus transportation was nullified in Morgan v. Virginia. The Shelley v. Kramer case held that courts could not enforce racially restrictive covenants, which were agreements between landlords not to sell real estate to minority groups. And perhaps one of the biggest victories occurred in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, where the doctrine of separate but equal, created in Plessy v. Ferguson, was judged to have no place in educational facilities.
Despite all of these advances made towards justice and equality for all citizens of the United States, segregation lingered on. President Eisenhower, elected in 1952, had different ideas on civil rights than Truman did. Being a Republican, he feared that if civil rights were given to blacks in the South, Republican influence would lessen in the South. This and his belief that if the federal government took action on civil rights, race relations would only deteriorate further, led him to not endorse the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Nevertheless, in 1957, Eisenhower was forced to take action when Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, refused to integrate public schools in the state. The president nationalized the Arkansas National Guard and sent troopers to protect 9 black teenagers, the Little Rock Nine. In 1957, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act over stark opposition, including the longest ever filibuster of 24 hours 18 minutes by die-hard segregationist Strom Thurmond. Thus, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights was created to investigate discrimination, especially in voting. The same year, an ordained minister and strong believer in the nonviolent philosophy of Mahatma Gandhi by the name of Martin Luther King Jr. became the first leader of the SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This conference was responsible for coordinating future civil rights activity. As civil rights progressed between 1945 and 1960, many parts of the American life changed, but one part that witnessed some of the most change was work exchange and technology. The black middle class, including veterans, union workers, and college-educated activists, began to lose their jobs as they saw white veterans coming home after fighting World War II and taking their jobs. Before World War II, the workforce had slimmed drastically as many of the white workers went to fight the war, which left their jobs open for others to occupy. Due to the decreasing number of white males, African Americans and women made use of this opportunity and filled in the abundant amount of vacant jobs. But soon after the war ended, the jobs of the African Americans and women would be taken away as more returning veterans came back and got preference as they looked for places to work. This social injustice, though, whites gained priority in all places compared to African Americans, was exposed in the novels Native Son by Richard Wright in 1940, An American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal in 1944, and the autobiography Black Boy by Wright in 1945. Along with these novels and the help of television, the North finally got to see the true atrocities, discrimination, and hardships that blacks in the South faced. In his famed essay on civil disobedience, Henry David Thoreau wrote this of an individual's obligation to actively challenge unjust institutions. A wise man will not leave the right to the mercy of chance, as there is but little virtue in the action of masses of men. In other words, when a nation is led astray of its core principles by its leadership, it is not only one's moral right, but one's moral duty to awaken from an unquestioning march towards ethical oblivion, and to voice one's support of what is right, even if one is alone in breaking the mindless silence of public opinion. The civil rights movement in the United States exhibited an exceptional devotion to this belief, through its organized use of peaceful protest from 1945 to 1960 and well beyond. From the Montgomery bus boycotts to the Greensboro Woolworth sit-ins. African Americans who intended to redeem their constitutionally assured checks from the Bank of Liberty Martin Luther King would speak of under the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, utilized American legal institutions to challenge American social institutions. Simultaneously, the squalid plight of the black man was exposed to the rest of a country blinded by complacency to its own internal machinations, predicated on racism and hatred, through accounts both literary and televised, of a legislative system devoid of integrity and designed with the intent of submerging that man in tidal waves of discrimination. Nevertheless, defying the mighty force of that cruel ocean, he refused to go under, striving relentlessly for the rejuvenating air that was equality, a substance imperative, though intangible, for the continued existence of any human being. And in doing so, those who partook in this movement secured that ambrosia for generations to come.